Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds is a film which I feel vaguely intimidated by when now choosing to write about it. I would feel this way about almost any classic Hitchcock picture because so much has been said about them, and I'm almost insecure at adding to any established discourses. Funny, he was once considered a simple tradesman, using his technical expertise to transcend thriller screenplays into grand vox populi cultural events. Gradually, he began to be perceived as the foremost exponent, the ideal illustrator of psychosexual, philosophical, Freudian undercurrents through cinema. It seems as though certain critics became obsessed with Hitchcock's subconscious manifestations and appeared to encourage the idea that all cinema could be read as studies on inherent human pathologies, the indirect communication as much as, if not more so, than the direct. Hitchcock's work really lent itself to critical ideas inspired by deconstruction, or the feminist analyses focusing upon the male gaze. The loosely modernist manner in which Hitchcock drew attention to his technical toolkit was likely very inspiring to those who sought to crack open a film and uncover its secrets, intended or otherwise. 1963's The Birds is one of the most seductive in this particular respect. Modern audiences watching The Birds, and especially those aware of the scholarly obsession hovering over Hitchcock, would no doubt be left with the looming question of why? What does it mean? What's the explanation? 1958's Vertigo may have been the genesis for those more dreamlike, ethereal, symbolic thrillers, such as those from David Lynch. You know, the kind of films where you show the average person born in the 1990s and onward, and they are immediately tempted to Google an explanation. Explain this to me. What was happening? Anyone who has seen and or is aware of Vertigo's reputation as a film which is flooding with juicy, hotly examined subtext will no doubt be of a mind to interpret The Birds in this fashion. It seems as though many individual critics have certainly done so. Before I get into any of that, however, if I get into any of that, however, I would just like to express my immediate personal thoughts on Hitchcock's The Birds. I find this film enrapturing and mystifying. I am almost completely comfortable saying that The Birds is one of my very favourite pieces of film art, and I'll elaborate upon why I now feel this way. This film opens with one of Hitchcock's best interiors ever, that San Francisco pet shop. This vivid set and its evocative depiction through considered cinematography and editing is a ready competitor with the other phenomenal interiors of Hitchcock's filmography, including Ernie's in Vertigo, the taxidermy shop in The Man Who Knew Too Much, 1956 version, and the mansion in Notorious. I've showed this set off extensively in my screenshots for good reason. Now I'd like to briefly get into this film's subject matter. I'd like to briefly get that out of the way. One will either laugh at this film's concept, birds, are you kidding me? I'm really shaking. Or alternatively, one will genuinely squirm. I'm serious. Both responses to this film's concept, upon hearing about it, there's this film called The Birds, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, this famous iconic horror film. The reaction is either one of, this is just going to be a laughable film, or that's going to be a terrifying film. The reason people might think it laughable is they can imagine what the effects would be like, again, what's so scary about birds. But the other half of that hypothetical audience, the one who would be more frightened at the prospect of viewing The Birds, are those who are genuinely terrified of that prospect. To many people, birds are bloody creepy. I was once attacked by 2 kookaburras when I was very young. They were just playing around, but it was absolutely terrifying at the time. Magpies, butcherbirds, grey miners are all known to swoop, cockatoos will crack at your windows if you don't feed them, and our crows are huge. Seriously, English and European visitors are stunned by how big Australian crows are. They are twice the size of the ravens you are familiar with. So yeah, birds, not my favourite animal. I've become desensitized to them, but I'm really glad they aren't massive. How could we have defended ourselves evolutionarily from flying predators? Thank God for that meteor that wiped out the pteranodons. I've included a link in the video description to an image of a life-size recreation of the prehistoric bird Argentavis magnificens, also known as the giant teraton. If you're scared of birds, don't open the link. All I'll say is I'm glad they're extinct. If we lost a war with emus, we'd definitely lose a war with those giant teratons. Hell, if the emus could fly, we'd be fucked. Point is, again, birds are pretty creepy. They were dinosaurs at one point. Cassowaries still are in all but name, and Jesus Christ, if they could fly, we'd be the endangered species. Now let's move on to praising this film's spectacular aesthetics and the two individuals on set, other than Hitchcock himself, who were responsible for this film's striking allure. Firstly, one of my absolute favourite cinematographers of all time, Robert Burks. Close to being his most vivid, spellbinding technicolor for Hitchcock, only Vertigo definitely tops it to my memory, Burks is responsible for transforming the initial segments of this film into a majesty which reminds one of Douglas Sirk, except, well, even better, more flirtatious, assertive, and 60s. Robert Burks is said to have been very hands-on for a Hollywood cinematographer, apparently having the audacity to suggest ideas to Hitchcock, who would listen intently. This has been verified by screenwriter John Michael Hayes, who penned Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, The Trouble with Harry, and The Man Who Knew Too Much, all shot by Burks. The Birds has been named, in the opinion of author Christopher Beach, as Burks' most impressive technical achievement overall. Here's why. Burks had worked in the photographing of special effects in Hollywood for some years prior to his becoming a fully fledged director of photography. The Birds VFX required it to contain over 1,500 shots, which was more than 3 times the number of shots normally featured in a film production at this time. It is said that more than 400 of these shots were composite images, spliced, I think, quite seamlessly into the rest of the film's authentic photography. Burks took it upon himself to ensure that the film's effects looked effective, allegedly spending over a year of work on the Birds throughout its pre- and post-production. Credit must also be given to costume designer Edith Head. Sometimes considered the greatest costume designer of all time, Head was responsible for Tippi Hedren's spectacular wardrobe for this film. The entire function of Tippi Hedren's character, her particular presentation and symbolism throughout the narrative, is really quite peculiar. I'd feel remiss not to mention the controversy surrounding Hitchcock and Hedren's relationship, and those aforementioned psychosexual manifestations, prospective evidence of Hitchcock's intrinsic gender politics. Hedren's character in The Birds, Melanie Daniels, is the nexus of this film's circumstances. Other characters in the plot start accusing her of being the cause of their ostensibly apocalyptic misfortune. Melanie Daniels may well be considered a MacGuffin. It is somehow challenging to imagine this horrifying incident occurring in Bodega Bay had Melanie not arrived to visit to instigate mischief. To be frank, The Birds seem like a divine punishment for Melanie's interference with this tranquil community. It is shocking, sickening to think about. What a bizarre and aggressive cinematic vision. This is surely one of the most oddly motivated and passionately insistent films I have ever seen. This film is no piece of, oh, people fought weirdly in the olden days. No. Imagine if this film came out today. One would think it full of symbolism and hidden meaning, a kind of experimental symbolic narrative. There's no reason to assume this 1963 film intended otherwise. This is no silly creature feature, is what I'm trying to say. I mean, it is, but it is also, like what many say of Ridley Scott's Alien, something also deeply hormonal, aesthetically precise, and technically resolute. One gets the impression that this was the exact film Hitchcock intended to make, and given the immense, unique creative control he was allowed during this later period, one can only deduce that this film was extraordinarily deliberated on Hitchcock's part. Now, the technical facet of The Birds which perhaps gets most discussed today, rather than its painstaking VFX, is its sound design. Now, this was clearly deliberate, and it is hard to imagine any other Hollywood director being permitted to do what Hitchcock did here, or didn't do rather than utilizing a familiar iconic series of Herman string sections. Hitchcock instead utilized sound effects and sparse source music in conjunction with intended sequences of silence. Oh boy. I feel like a fool. I feel like the narrator of a yacht rock song. What a fool I've been for you. I often cited the area where my man Brian De Palma superseded Hitchcock as being that of the reliance on non-diegetic music. Yeah, obviously De Palma uses music extensively throughout his films, but I truly believe that De Palma's many exemplary visual sequences would be considered effective even without a musical accompaniment. Can we say the same of Hitchcock's shower scene in Psycho? I don't think so. Can we say this of Dressed to Kill's elevator scene, Scarface's final shootout, the terminal patient scene in Raising Cain, or the subway chase in Carlito's Way? I think, absolutely, they would still be rather effective even without their respective musical accompaniments. Without Bernard Herrmann's screeching strings, the shower scene in Hitchcock's Psycho would feel brutal and jarring in a very roughly avant-garde fashion. Frankly, it would feel very subversive and possibly proto-punk, but a frankly amateurish attack on narrative expectations. It would come across as equally lazy as it is daring. Now, with Bernard Herrmann's screeching strings, the shower scene in Psycho announces that not only can this film's narrative no longer be trusted with our expectations, but that cinema itself, unlike the language reliance of theatre and literature, was not going to, did not have to, conform to any established narrative rules. Here, the score announces something more than the premeditated emotional vector of a moment. It announces that the film was very specifically building up to this moment, willingly deceiving its audience. Hitchcock declares that he deliberately built trust with the audience so that he could traumatize them for his own amusement. This medium is a thing to behold, how it can lure one in and then psychologically assault like that. It proves that the great director was the greatest magician of all time. The great director could not fall back on word association, affecting an audience's imagination as narrative forms had prior. Rather, by stimulating the sensory, the filmmaker could simulate the extremes of the human pathos, communicate consciousness as no other medium had ever before. Seriously, ask yourselves why is the shower scene more affecting with music than without? It's not superficial. What are the deep mental roots as to why it affects us in this way? It would feel like a subversive statement without music, but with music, it comes across as a deliberate, intentional crescendo in the narrative, and so its unpredictability violates an audience's prior anticipations. It feels less subversive, actually, and more like a valid narrative possibility, both internal and external, of the film's fictional universe, if you know what I mean. Some might be tempted to dismiss the whole shattering of expectations mid-narrative twist thing to be somewhat novelty, gimmicky, and a product of its time, less impressive in an era where a narrative subversion in cinema is now far more commonplace, even among the mainstream, and especially one wherein almost every conceivable first-time viewer of Psycho in the 21st century is aware of what will happen in that iconic motel bathroom before it does. So yes, that's by a long, convoluted way of saying that music was important to Hitchcock. But I suppose I can no longer use that against him because even he, the great genius, realized his reliance upon Bernard Herrmann in Psycho, and so sought to realize, in some ways, an answer or a continuation of the filmmaking philosophies initially explored in Psycho. No music in The Birds, and it is absolutely genius. This film makes one briefly consider whether the utilization of non-diegetic scores in cinema was a fundamental creative mistake, but then if one considers Psycho without Herrmann, they then realize that The Birds was set up deliberately to explore the effectiveness of horror thriller cinema without the creative crutches of musical composition. The standout sequence here is the series of explosions as a result of the fuel line, one of Hitchcock's best, and a fantastic precedent for films exploring, choosing to depict intense, fast-paced or action-based sequences without relying on non-diegetic sound. The sonic palette that is featured within The Birds is lavish and quite terrifying. If we use a similar test as before, imagining The Birds without its iconic sound design, is to reduce this film to a careless creature feature afterthought, and not as a genuine, technically creative experiment. This film's structure reminds me of Psycho. Insofar as Psycho is meant to be a quasi-experiment in film narrative structuring, The Birds can be viewed in the same regard. And now let's address the aspect of this film which has made it immediately difficult to appreciate in the decades since its release, for many it seems, compared to other noted Hitchcock classics. I am of course referring to the visual effects. And honestly, I don't know if my expectations were lowered, but viewing this film in Blu-ray quality, I don't know. I think the effects look pretty good? Rather good. Sometimes great even. It's only when the birds start moving about that they might look noticeably fake and or phony, and even then, not overwhelmingly so. They might look a bit silly in shots/frames wherein they are right next to humans, flying over them or physically attacking them, but honestly, not extremely so. My memories of viewing this film in DVD quality had me understanding why the Bird's VFX have been routinely mocked over the years. But in this Blu-ray quality, for some reason, the effects look good now. Did they redo the effects? Surely not. No idea why. You be the judge. I'd consider the most impressive, affecting moment of VFX in The Birds is the visceral sensory fright of the chimney invasion. That sequence has you rubbing your skin in anguish. You start to squirm, shiver, extremely grateful you aren't in these characters' shoes. I think that sequence where the birds are chasing the school children down the road is the one which is referred to as having lousy VFX, but viewing it again, I don't really feel this way, honestly. I mean, the last thing I thought or felt to do in watching that scene again is laugh. It's fucking horrifying watching crows try to mutilate children. It is utter cacophony. I'm not smiling whatsoever. If that's MST3K fodder, then what cinematic violence isn't? That's a serious question. May as well laugh at The Wild Bunch or A Taxi Driver or hell, August Underground while we're at it. The one VFX sequence which Hitchcock could not ultimately commit to was a proposed final shot featuring the Golden Gate Bridge covered in birds. That could have been the greatest final shot of all time. And think about it, doesn't that speak volumes about this film's fundamental intent? This idea that nature is punishing humankind for its obsession with trivialities, materialism, and ignorance of its actions, consequences on the surrounding environment. So those extended, possibly incoherent spiels are why I absolutely adore Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. I am now thoroughly obsessed with it. I absolutely love natural horror in most 20th century circumstances, but like Spielberg's Hitchcockian, though arguably not subtextually, 1975 classic Jaws, it transcends genre stock and becomes a modernist display of cinematic supremacy. In the literal sense, The Birds comes across as an experimental film. Well, not belonging to the school of experimental film as such, Anger, Brakhage, Mecha, Snow, et al. I'd love to discuss some of that good stuff here eventually. Rather, The Birds feels like an experimental narrative film. Psycho almost inarguably was, and The Birds maybe even more so. Thank you, and have a great day. I hope some of this was actually articulate and made sense. I'm not sure if it did, if I'm reading it aloud. Anyway, have a great one, everyone.